All right. I don't talk about video games very often, and I've retained it mostly to the backlog area of the blog that I put together once in a while. But here I came up with the top 10 video games of the year because I played 10 good ones this year, and that hasn't happened for a while. You might remember I used to play a lot more video games. I used to review things every couple of weeks, and it just it hasn't it's been such a time sink to play anything these days, and the quality is so variable that I just haven't wanted to waste any money on it, when I could be covering music and spending more time with things that are a little bit more redeeming. And I think there are five really good examples of products that I thought would be exceptional that turned out to be anything but redeeming. I think Diablo 4 and Starfield speak for themselves in terms of being kind of embarrassing corporate garbage that is meant for the lowest common denominator, and is a subpar performance overall as a video game, and doesn't live up to the quality that each studio and people involved have done before. I'm not saying that they don't deliver on a baseline experience, but for someone who's been playing video games since the late 80s, uh, this they were just didn't live up to that highest standard where those products have been before. Darkest Dungeon was just more of a roguelite and less of an RPG. That was a bummer. It kind of ruined the experience in terms of replayability. Um, Although, the runs were fun to start, I think that it was too prescribed in terms of the gimmick for each boss fight, and not that much fun. Lords of the Fallen was a complete mess, an overpriced pile of garbage, worse than the first game. I can't believe that anyone got to that ending, either ending of the game, and didn't just throw their controller at the ground, because that's what I did. It was just a complete disaster of a game that looked like shit and played like shit. Um, Alan Wake 2 is not a bad game at all. It was embarrassing. The story was embarrassing, and I think that's from someone who loved Control, which was very similar in a lot of ways, but just um, better. Better as an experience, and I'll leave it at that. Uh, so this was the year of countless remakes. I don't didn't include Resident Evil 4 because I've never cared for Resident Evil 4. I know that's like a sacred cow for a lot of people who play video games. I just don't care about Resident Evil 4. Um, Metroid Prime, I do. That was a big one. Dead Space was a huge favorite of mine back in the day. I like that they've updated it. It's not essential, and System Shock is not essential either in terms of a remake, but those are there's some guaranteed fun to be had from both of those games. The big surprise was that Star Ocean: The Second Story, which I think the Second Story R is the third remake of this game overall. Maybe just the second, but it's set in 2.5D. It looks very good. If you're a fan of like Octopath Traveler and the way that those games look, this is kind of that update, but from more dynamic angles, and it emulates a lot of the experience from the PlayStation game by just adding some quality of life experience. It's not a perfect game, but I think by the time you get to maybe the arena in the city, you'll appreciate the game as a whole. And it's just, for me, it's one of my favorites from the PlayStation era, and for a sci-fi RPG, which I detailed when I've reviewed Star Ocean games before. That's a good one. And I think the surprise for me overall was Etrian Odyssey getting an Origins collection. These were uh, handheld Game Boy games, basically, where it's a dungeon crawler, a 3D dungeon crawler, but also a JRPG as well. And these are very niche games where there's very involved mapping system. You go and you map out dungeons, and these remasters help you do that in a much easier way. They kind of ease you into this series in the first three games. I hope they do the next three, which were Nintendo DS games. I think that would be really exceptional to get all of those. But as is these three games on this collection, the Odyssey Origins collection, I think you'll probably spend hundreds of hours on those games if you can put up with the art style and whatnot. Which similar comments on the art style of Sea of Stars. This is my number 10 game of the year. This is what looked like a sort of Chrono Trigger esque game turns out to be a fairly surface level 2D Japanese style RPG per the 16-bit era, and with a little bit of enhanced graphics, a couple of surprises and twists and turns, some interesting characters. All of it is very surface level. All of it is very pretty. It has a great soundtrack. And remember, these are the people who made The Messenger, so a lot of that style is there in terms of the sound design and the attitude of the writing. So it's retro inspired. It's a little bit ironic, but it's also very straightforward as an RPG experience. And um, I wouldn't say that this blew my mind. I saw people giving it 10 out of 10. This is maybe a 7 out of 10 at best if you connected with the story and liked the graphics. The gameplay was very average, and fundamentally this Japanese style RPG doesn't have progression. It features progression in probably the first 2 or 3 hours of gameplay where you begin to gain skills, and it tries to implement a lot of team fight skills and collaborative spells that you can cast when you've built up hits and blocks and whatnot. But uh, gameplay is so shallow that it's just too easy, or it's just draining and a waste of time to sit there and work up to these skills when regular attacks do well enough unless you crank up the difficulty. So instead of making it harder, I chose to make the game easier by using certain items and just enjoyed the story at one point because the gameplay became both tedious and less than challenging. So, heavy criticism for a game that I've got on my best of the year, but it does have a certain charm that is worth considering. And I think it was more fun than I had with a lot of games in recent memory in this style. Not as good as Chained Echoes. I think that was just a fantastic game last year, and this, while the graphics were much better on this game, I don't think that it lived up quite to that standard. But I hope they make more of these rather than switching off to a new project, because uh, clearly there's a lot they could learn from this game that would make the next one even bigger. So there you go. So Pizza Tower is it seems like it was just kind of a fun indie game that someone made as a project, just exploring a certain art style, and it turned into one of the most fun platforming games, of which there were a few this year that were any good, outside of ROM hacking and things like that. This is essentially Wario Land 5. If you've played those games, they're mostly handheld games, and it's akin to Mario if you could dash through walls and stuff like that. This is a game with a great sense of humor. It was a lot of fun to play. It's got kind of like this um, Ren and Stimpy kind of look to it. I guess that's what I've seen other people compare it to, and I had fun with it. I think every level was different. Every level was interesting. I think that there was a lot of insight put into developing a fun experience level to level that was unpredictable, goofy, and it was kind of a meme throughout. I also played Tiny Thor, a similar exploration of level design, but much more difficult since I couldn't complete the game because I'm just not that coordinated anymore. Uh, this was my choice, but I usually lean towards something a little bit more retro and less just goofy, whatnot. I think you can even play this game on itch.io for free. I think it's a Flash game as far as I know, so no excuse not to check it out. I've included Lunacid here because I think this is a game worth playing more than once, and the value is obviously there, but the charm of it might wear off pretty quickly because this is a fairly maze-like 3D first-person RPG, and definitely a dungeon crawler that relies on you retaining your memory for places and items and things. And I think this is very much designed by and made for the Metroidvania brain, where it's like, oh, come back to this place later when you have that ability or you have that insight. So in a way, you might look at it and see Shadow Tower and Eternal Ring, But maybe if you enjoyed like Metroid Prime, there's a lot to like in this game as well. It is an indie title, and there are some bugs and quirks to it that are just kind of having fun. But overall, it is a very atmospheric and interesting action RPG with a lot of options for classes and skills, and just a lot of fun to be had in general if you like, ancient PC RPGs and the old From Software games that were more fantasy based. I think the game that gave me the most trouble here at the end of the year in terms of trying to finish it and kind of bruising my way through is this quite long and involved Metroidvania from Kumi Souls, The Last Faith. I think The Last Faith, it would be easy to play the first couple of hours and say, oh, this is kind of a blasphemous clone. It does a lot of the things that it does. This is not exactly Symphony of the Night in any respect, and the graphics and sound are very similar. It seems cut from the same cloth. But as you get deeper into the game, you realize that there's a magic system. There's a very specific way of blocking and parrying, and it was very much a trial by fire for me. It was a very difficult from the first boss. The simplest amount of movement and dodging away from an enemy it seems to take forever to learn the timing of, and I had such trouble with that in Moonscars that I felt like I was going to drop this game. But eventually, this is an achievable game. There's a lot of options for classes, which might make your first try easier or harder. I chose a more difficult option, unfortunately, and I would say that the magic use eventually pays off. And there's a lot that's really interesting about this game, although probably the hardest Metroidvania I've played and finished in quite a while, and that includes Blasphemous 2, which was considerably easier. So when I reviewed Atomic Heart earlier this year, I was both enamored with the quality of the experience, the atmosphere of the game itself, and the gameplay was being very sharp, but all of it felt like it wasn't completely there. And when I returned to it and I kind of played around with it for the DLC eventually, and I sort of took stock of some of the things I'd experienced, I realized, a lot of strange and terrible games came out this year, and this was one of the ones that I had the most fun with. I think that the dialogue with the implant in your head is insufferable at times, and as much as people said this wasn't a political game, it very much is in terms of its dialogue and its message and what it has to say and muse over. But also, it's a very tightly controlled and immersive game that is a lot of fun to explore. And I only wish there was more of it, because I probably would have spent another 10 to 15 hours with a larger overworld and more dungeons, quote unquote dungeons or labs to explore, because I felt like there was always something important that I'd gained, even when I ran out of things and upgrade and weapons that I like to use. So for anyone who likes, Deus Ex and immersive sims like Bioshock, there is some of that in here, but this is maybe more action oriented at the same time, and it's kind of a fun cinematic experience, which has its annoying quirks. So, a lot of interesting choices to make, a terrible ending or two, but still one of the best games of the year by far. So I didn't buy Liza P right away because it looked like a cheap, shitty Souls-like, and in a lot of ways it still has that DNA of kind of garbage Souls-likes that came after Dark Souls 3 became most popular, where maybe they changed around some of the art style, but it was fundamentally just Dark Souls. Liza P learns is maybe a couple generations ahead in terms of designing level experiences, designing combat and enemies, and it takes a lot of cues from Elden Ring's boss fights in terms of both enemy design and boss design, where um, there's a lot of delayed attacks, and that will take some time to get used to because the parry system is quite unforgiving, and there's a lot of options you have to work around that. It's a very difficult game, but for as far as 3D semi-open world action RPGs go, it's a great game. It's very difficult. My experience was more difficult because they nerfed the difficulty after I think a couple of patches in, and I had already basically finished the game before they did that. So I definitely fought some bosses for 3 hours at a time. I definitely used every bit of my arsenal that I possibly could to try and survive through a lot of these bosses. So if you feel proud about, you know, uh, not summoning your help or things like that for Souls games, you're going to have a tough time with this game. Primarily because there just aren't the same amount of invincibility frames and options to escape damage as there are in other games. And it all just requires quite a lot of precision from the player. And that made it one of the most fun challenges of the year, and also one of the most frustrating games of the year. I definitely deleted the game a couple of times while I was playing it because I was so frustrated. The the junkyard abomination, whatever it's called, was kind of my tipping point where I was just freaking out about how hard it was, but eventually it actually became very easy once I changed around some of my options. So anyway, point being, I really liked the challenge this game presented, and I felt like it was eventually worth buying and playing more than once. Although, not every sort of choice for weapon class is as interesting or fulfilling as the next, and you're going to have to probably create your own challenges to keep breathing life into a game which is not that long and not that fun to replay. Because of a few points that are just frustrating, such as the multi-enemy bosses, which are just poorly designed. So, not a perfect game, but certainly one of the better ones of the year from my point of view. Blasphemous 2 has sequelitis. I think that's the obvious thing from the moment you turn it on, and it gives you this extended cutscene that makes no sense at all because the first game didn't make any sense at all, and it's all just kind of complete nonsense, religious gobbledygook from Orthodox uh, Gnosticism or I don't Catholicism. I don't know, but. The lore is inconsequential and surreal, and I think that matches the tone of the first game while giving a lot more colorful options to the player. Um, in terms of locales to visit, it's a little bit more of an open-ended exploration here. In terms of a Metroidvania, that means that no matter where you go for the first third of the game, probably maybe almost the first half, there isn't an extreme challenge. Now, the first boss you encounter will certainly be difficult. The first one you easily can encounter is, it's more of just learning the pattern and jumping and basic things like that. But by the time you get to the second boss, you've probably got such an arsenal of multiple weapons. You've probably gotten all three of the main weapons and can swap between them, and you've got different modes of movement. Um, it becomes a very different game than Blasphemous 1 was, which was a game of maybe precision and flow, where the movement was almost, it developed in the same way that Symphony of the Night did, where you slowly become more agile and more equipped to deal with anything they throw at you. And in this game, uh, they keep throwing the same things at you, even though you've become more agile. And so it's just more of a game. It's bigger, more of it. The sequel is a little bit more, or the music is a little bit more dramatic. The levels and the bosses are a bit more gory, and some of the bosses are just extremely difficult, whereas others are simple. So it's a game of preparation and retrying a couple of times. There's a little bit of a punishment for dying, but nothing outside of the realm of a Souls game. And I think ultimately, even though The Last Faith gave me more interesting world and some a bit of nonsense, otherwise this game is just more polished, easier to pick up, more fun to play through, and it's a game I could see myself playing more than once. They updated the original Blasphemous to the point where it became a slightly different game, and I'm assuming that they'll continue to work on this game with some expansions, the way they did with the first. Although I don't know that I'm ready for a Blasphemous 3. I think that it would be more interesting for them to do something else and see what else they can do. Uh, Otherwise, this is a very worthy sequel. I was expecting it to be my game of the year, but the story just became a mush of nonsense to me where I just didn't enjoy it. So my top three video games of the year are all going to be um, what people would consider AAA titles, or some of the biggest games of the year. So not a lot to say about any of them, but I think Cyberpunk 2077 Phantom Liberty isn't just about uh, the DLC and its content, but about 2.0 and 2.1 for Cyberpunk 2020, which released back in 2020 or 2077. It released back in 2020, and it was a buggy mess. It was a broken game. It was removed to this from the stores. Infamously, and I played through it no matter what. I enjoyed it quite a bit, but it was a broken game. Uh, Much in the same way that Witcher 3 changed within about a year completely, with completely new inventory and a couple of new spell systems and, rates of earning points and things like that, and loot sorting. The same thing has happened to Cyberpunk 2077, but without any real upgrades in loot management. So they've changed the way the skill system works. The DLC unlocks a powers that unlock in the relic that is stuck in your head, and it was nice to return to this game and remember the 100 or so hours that I'd spent with it back in 2020. I think that they've improved the game across the board in terms of performance. It never crashed. Once when I played it for 30 more hours, maybe 40 more hours this year. I think that Phantom Liberty takes a while to warm up. It isn't until you've met Madam President and you've kind of gotten into the thick of things and explored the area a little bit more that it starts to make sense that you're there. But it's not a huge area, and it really does rely on the performances of the other characters and following the story intently. They give you a couple of side projects, but really it is the main story that you're going to want to follow and push through, even though by the time you're out of Phantom Liberty and you're done with the DLC, you're probably going to be, you're probably overpowered going into it. You're going to be even more so going out of it, because you kind of you get like a crisis style cloak system from it if you decide to. There's no reason not to get, some of those relic powers all the way up. And for me, it was critical hits that kind of helped out, and I already had things that modified that. Anyway, it is still kind of an RPG, and your gear is still important, but they've simplified it. And that's unfortunate, because there were so many things that I spent so much time upgrading that they basically deleted, and that included the clothing system. Clothing had stats and abilities attached to it, and now that's all gone. You might get armor from some vests, but that's about it. And that's the craziest shit ever, considering how much time I spent upgrading all of my clothing and all the resources I spent upgrading all of it too. So while that is a bummer, it didn't make me feel underpowered when I reskilled the entire thing, and I would play through the game again. Certainly, I think that this is enough of an expansion and an improvement where now this game is fully worth recommending. It is one of the better games that I've played in the last 5 years. I think that it got a bad rap for a good reason, but this is a great game, and full of polish, great presentation, and very fun gameplay. So there was certainly hype surrounding Baldur's Gate 3, but I think everyone felt pretty good about it. I've been a fan of Larian Studios for a very long time, since Divinity 2 released, at least over 10 years ago. I don't remember when it was. And I mean the original Divinity 2, not Original Sin, which was a third-person action RPG, and one that was pretty centered around folks who could transform into dragons. It was kind of the next best thing after hoping that Panzer Dragoon Saga would ever turn into anything else. Anyway, I digress, because this is supposed to be the sequel to Baldur's Gate 2, I think at least a century or so afterwards. But it is not related directly to those events per se. It depends how you interpret that. But this is more of an isometric strategy RPG in the vein of Divinity Original Sin 1 and 2. And that's not too far from the design of classic PC RPGs, but it doesn't play like Pillars of Eternity necessarily. So, nor is it's vaguely closer to what you'd expect if you played the Pathfinder games in recent memory, But this is probably the most refined version of that I've played to date. It is fun to get into combat. It is fun to try different things. I think rolling back your save is one of the best things you can do, uh, in terms of not so much save scumming, but seeing all of the options available to every combat encounter and just having fun with all the options that you have. As this is especially fun in the first act, where you're exploring a wide variety of areas that have a broad variety of characters and choices to interact with, and your interactions do unlock different combat options, and the development of these characters is brilliant. It is a brilliant game. It is as good as everyone ever said it was. That said, I didn't have enough time with it to really immerse the way I would have, say, 10 years ago. I'm a bit older and I only have maybe 4 hours at a time where I can sit down with a game like this and not be distracted. So it wasn't forgiving in that sense, where I definitely had to hit the save button, or cancel out of a long, maybe an hour and a half long encounter, because I needed to do other things and I couldn't hit the pause button per se. So that's not the fault of the game. But also, I found that I didn't like some of my choices and where they led, and no matter what I did, and no matter where I went with them, it felt like Act 3 forced that choice to mean something that I didn't want it to, or as some people have noticed, if you decide someone should die, maybe they come back for some reason, and that didn't make sense. The third act wasn't maybe completely finished or as polished as it is now, probably, but that took away from the experience immediately as I was kind of pushing through it quickly. And I think that I'll have to play through this game on a very long and slow playthrough a second time to really do the things that I wanted to and get the things that I wanted out of it. And, I've had the same issue with Pillars of Eternity, where I've replayed the game 3 times, and now I'm finally, it's the way I want it to be. And I think that's maybe the charm of Dungeons and Dragons related things, is that you eventually do get it right, even if much of life is up to chance or the roll of the dice. So, amazing game, but not quite my favorite game of the year. And we could consider this the one that I probably played the most and appreciated the most, but it's not the absolute number one. So I know that choosing Final Fantasy 16 as my game of the year will seem kind of cheesy. It is just kind of a simple action RPG. There's not a lot of customization. There's a thorough side quest system, but none of it is particularly difficult. And most of the game it chooses cinematics over difficulty. This is a simple game in terms of combat. It's a lot of button mashing. It's not that different than 15 was, in most respects, but it's less flying through the air and more ground combat. And I think that helped, maybe made some of the timed dodges more fun and whatnot. But beyond that point, I haven't had fun with a Final Fantasy game since 12, and I mean the kind of fun that I had when I was a kid, when I was playing all of the original games. And this was a series that got me and millions of other people into Japanese RPGs. And there's at least some of the high fantasy spirit and a bit of Game of Thrones in there too, that helps keep it grounded in what I'd always imagined when I was playing these games back in the day, not the cyber anime whatnot of the last several games. And so for me, this is kind of the the game that I've liked the most since 12, but also it's a good story. It takes a long time to develop. They sort of struggle through a lot of the storytelling, and some of the voice acting. I just heard too much this year. I played Diablo 4 right before this game, and the same voice actor features in this game prominently, so I just heard his gravelly voice for literally, I think, 80 hours in a row as a side narrator, and to the main character. And it was taxing to say the least, but not that big of a deal. I think this is a great story, and the presentation, um, you know, I wouldn't gush over all of this, but if I had to stack the boxes in front of me and say which one am I going to remember 5 years from now, I'm going to remember the hype around Baldur's Gate 3. I'm going to remember the 140 hours I played it, but maybe the 40 hours I spent playing Final Fantasy 16 was just more memorable. It was a bit more of a story for me, and it was more of a experience in terms of, uh, you know, developing this main character, and maybe he's not embarrassing like so many Final Fantasy lead characters have been for so long. So maybe it's just what I wanted out of this series, and as a big fan, I think they did really well with this game, and I hope that that's the direction they take this sort of serious and gritty feeling rather than the Kingdom Hearts style bullshit that we find in the Final Fantasy remakes. So uh, it was just particularly to my taste, and I'm not saying it's the best game overall for any practical reason, but it is my favorite of the year.